When people use scripture, like the Bible, for example, or the Quran, or well, any of the other holy texts, as sources of wisdom, or as providing tenets for some sort of faith or some sort of action, maybe, they're often, well, they always, I would say, cherry pick the parts of the text they want, and it's often criticised, I think, by non-believers, and indeed by other believers sometimes if they happen to cherry pick different ones. So, for example, people who have a relatively liberal understanding of Christianity tend to ignore large parts of the Old Testament, tend to ignore Deuteronomy and Leviticus, tend to ignore lots of the statements about how it's okay to keep slaves, how it's okay to stone people to death, that kind of thing. Tend to ignore those parts and just read through the more acceptable parts to do with loving thy neighbour or turning the other cheek, that kind of thing. And it's a valid criticism, I think. It is a valid criticism to say that how sacred is this text if really all you're doing is just cherry picking the bits you like and ignoring the bits you don't like. And it's certainly a very good critique against the idea that sacred texts can act as a foundation for morality, because I think, as Dawkins and Sam Harris and a few others have pointed out, if we are able to look at these texts and then make choices about which ones we regard as moral, then we must have a moral sense to begin with. It's not something which is deriving from the text, it's something which we apply to the text. And I think it's also been mentioned, and this is something Sam Harris and I think Christopher Hitchens also says, is really the only people who don't cherry pick from texts are fundamentalists, extreme fundamentalists in many cases, who do take Deuteronomy seriously and Leviticus seriously and do take Bishop Ussher's age of the earth is 6,000 years literally, and so on. And those are the conclusions you would have to come to if you didn't cherry pick. So cherry picking is a standard technique of scriptural exegesis, really, and interpretation as well, of course. But let's just stick with cherry picking for now. And it's usually presented as a kind of critique. In a sense it is, but I think at the same time, I think there's something quite useful about that. It reminds me of, this is going to sound terribly irrelevant, but I'll mention it anyway. It reminds me of what you do when you go to an Indian restaurant, or more specifically when you're ringing up for Indian food. I had to ring up for Indian food recently, and I got on the phone and the guy said, "What would you like to order?" And I couldn't think of a thing. You know what I mean? I just could not think of a thing. So I ended up ordering the 2 or 3 things that I usually order: vegetable rogan josh, Peshwari naan, some boiled rice, some matar paneer, 1 or 2 other bits of things that I know I like. Because I simply couldn't think of anything else. I had the hunger, that was there, the desire for nourishment, and I had some vague knowledge of the sort of things I would like to eat, but I didn't have the specifics. And those specifics were, and it wasn't just that I had the specifics I would like. I couldn't even think of what I didn't like. I couldn't think of all the things on the Indian menu that I would not like. Whereas, of course, if I'd been in the restaurant or if I'd had access to the menu, I wouldn't have been presented with that problem. I would have been able to cherry pick from the menu those things which I felt best corresponded to and would satisfy the very real hunger that I felt, in that case, for Indian food. It doesn't diminish the quality of the menu, and it doesn't disqualify other people from picking the things off the menu that I would dislike, although I probably wouldn't get into some sort of holy war with them over it. But it did provide me with access to a more detailed understanding of my hunger than I would otherwise have had. So, I don't want to belabor that metaphor any further. PB guy, come on! Here's my dog's going with the road. Come on, pup! So, at the risk of carrying that metaphor until it staggers, I guess all I'm saying is that the scriptural text, either the ones we've got or maybe some new ones that we can write, don't necessarily lose their credibility simply because we cherry pick from them. We have to cherry pick from them. We cherry pick from texts which aren't scriptural, and indeed we cherry pick in routine conversations. We don't respond to every single thing a person says. We pick out the bits that are interesting and continue the debate from there, don't we? So I think this idea of cherry picking is actually an important understanding. It's something that I think Karen Armstrong talks about. I think she talks, well, I'm not completely wrong here, I'm thinking of somebody else, but never mind. I think she talks about a scriptural text as a kind of mirror, and what you see in the text reflects what you bring to it. So if you bring to it small-minded bigotry, then quite likely you are going to see the passages in Deuteronomy and Leviticus written in bold. If you bring to it a different sort of open-mindedness, open-heartedness, if you like, then perhaps what reflects out of that text is something closer to some of the interesting things that Jesus or some of the other prophets may or may not have said. I'm not making any claim that these texts are true, of course. That's completely irrelevant. In the way of best good poetry, they don't have to be true. They just have to be smart. I love this tree over here. It was struck by lightning, this tree, about 2 years ago. As you can see, it didn't die, but it has bifurcated, so that it's now growing in two opposite directions, two half trees. Just put the camera there so I can get a close-up of it. There it is.